Have you ever really thought about how a book like the Bible got its table of contents? It feels so permanent, so set in stone. Well, we're about to dive into the story of one small local meeting that made a huge decision, one that could have completely changed one of the world's most influential books as we know it. Let's get into it. Just think about that for a second. What if the book of Revelation, that dramatic, prophetic, final book of the New Testament, was just gone? It sounds pretty wild, right? Well, believe it or not, there was a moment in history when a group of church leaders got together, made an official list of sacred books, and that's exactly what they did. So to really get why this happened, you gotta picture the scene. We're in the 4th century. Christianity had just been legalized, and it was absolutely exploding across the Roman Empire. But that kind of growth was, well, kind of messy. There was a ton of debate, not a lot of consistency. Different churches were reading different books, and there was this growing feeling that somebody needed to lay down some ground rules. And that need for rules brings us to our main event, a small meeting of church leaders in a city called Laodicea. Now, this wasn't some giant empire-wide conference. It was a local gathering. But its decisions, wow, they would echo for centuries. Let's put this on a timeline just to get our bearings. So, in 313 AD, Christianity becomes legal. A little over a decade later, you have the famous Council of Nicaea, which hammered out some core beliefs. And then right here in 364 AD, the Council of Laodicea happens. You can see it's all part of this bigger push to bring some structure and organization to the faith. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, the location itself. Laodicea was this important city in what is now modern-day Turkey. And get this, here's the big irony. Laodicea is one of the 7 specific churches that the book of Revelation is addressed to. So hold on to that thought, because it makes what they decided to do even more fascinating. So how big was this council that was making these huge decisions? You'd think it would be massive, right? Nope, it was tiny. We're talking about 30 members, all from local churches in the area. This was not a gathering of the entire Christian world, but a small group trying to sort out their own local issues. So what did these 30 leaders actually do? Well, they created a rule book. They came up with 60 specific rulings, or canons, that were all designed to bring some order and consistency to how church was done. And these rules covered pretty much everything. We're talking about the real nitty-gritty stuff, like what you could or couldn't eat during Lent, all the way to bigger theological issues. They took a stand against things like astrology and even specified which day was the proper day of rest. They were basically trying to build a clear framework for everyday faith. But out of all 60 of those rulings, there were 2 that would become their most famous and controversial legacy. This is the moment they shifted their focus from how to run a church to the actual books everyone was reading. It all kicked off with Canon 59. The rule itself was simple. During church, you should only read from the canonical books, the official ones. Well, that immediately begs the question, right? What are the canonical books? The council knew they had to provide an answer, an actual list. And that brings us to the very next rule, Canon 60. This is where they laid out their official list of books. And let's just say, this list had a couple of major surprises in it. Okay, here it is. For the Old Testament, they included pretty much all the familiar books, but they tacked on one extra, the Book of Baruch. Okay, interesting. But the New Testament, that's where the real bombshell drops. They listed almost all the books we know today, with one glaring omission. They left out the book of Revelation, just not on the list. So the big question is, why? Why add a book like Burke but give Revelation the boot? Well, the answer really gets into how the early church thought about these texts. They made a distinction between books that were useful for teaching and books that they believed were truly divinely inspired. And for a lot of people back then, Revelation was, well, it was a pretty controversial book. And this is where this key term apocrypha comes into play. Books like Baruch were often put in this category. They were seen as sacred, they were great for teaching, but a lot of church leaders didn't think they carried the same weight of divine inspiration as, say, Genesis or the Gospels. They were valuable, for sure, but maybe in a slightly different class. And here's the crucial thing to remember. The council's decision didn't come out of nowhere. They weren't some radical group. Their thinking was actually right in line with some of the biggest church figures of the day. For many of them, Revelation was tricky. Its authorship was debated, and its wild, apocalyptic imagery could be confusing and maybe even disruptive if read in a church service. So their list was really just a snapshot of a much bigger, ongoing conversation. And that brings us all the way back to this one incredible idea. This wasn't the final absolute ruling for all of Christianity, not by a long shot. But this list, from this tiny meeting of just 30 people, got copied, it got circulated, and it became massively influential. It actually shaped Bibles and theological arguments for hundreds of years to come. So this all leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about. The books that millions of people read today were put together through a long, very human process of debate and discussion. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do these ancient conversations, these lists from small meetings, still echo in how people think and what they believe in our world right now?